How did one of Russia's most fortified regions become its most vulnerable pressure point almost overnight? In early 2025, Kaliningrad woke up to a reality that would have sounded unthinkable just a few years earlier. Tighter borders, thinner supply lines, and a growing sense that the exclave was being slowly sealed off from both Europe and the Russian mainland. What once functioned as Russia's western window now feels like a geopolitical cul-de-sac, and the shock of that transformation has rippled through every layer of local life. This is not merely a regional inconvenience. It is a warning signal flashing at the edge of Europe. Kaliningrad's geographic position has always been paradoxical. Wedged between NATO members and separated from Russia by hundreds of kilometers, it survived for decades on openness transit and pragmatic cooperation. Trucks, trains, and ferries moved steadily. Borders were crossed for work, shopping, education, and tourism. That fragile equilibrium collapsed after the war in Ukraine escalated and sanctions hardened into a permanent feature of European security policy. By 2025, the cumulative effect was impossible to ignore. Transit volumes dropped, shipping costs surged, and entire sectors of the local economy began operating in survival mode rather than growth. The shock was not only economic, it was psychological. Residents who once felt closer to Gdansk or Vilnius than to Moscow suddenly found themselves treated as a strategic liability rather than a bridge. Kaliningrad's population had grown accustomed to a semi-European rhythm of life shaped by cross-border ties and access to foreign goods. When those links were cut or restricted, the region did not simply lose trade, it lost a sense of direction. Supermarket shelves told one story, rising prices another, and the growing presence of security forces yet another. Together, they painted a picture of a territory being managed through control rather than confidence. What made the moment especially jarring was the contrast with the Kremlin's messaging. Official rhetoric continued to describe Kaliningrad as a stronghold, a bastion of Russian power projecting influence into the Baltic Sea. On the ground, however, residents experienced delays in fuel deliveries, shortages of construction materials, and a growing dependence on maritime routes that were never designed to carry such volumes alone. Ferries became lifelines, but also bottlenecks. Small businesses found themselves squeezed out by larger firms able to secure limited shipping slots, while local authorities scrambled to plug budget gaps that widened month by month. This disconnect between image and reality exposed a deeper problem. Kaliningrad had been optimized for integration, not isolation. Its ports, logistics hubs, and service industries thrived when borders were permeable. Once those borders hardened, the region's structural weaknesses were laid bare. By early 2025, regional budgets were under strain, investment plans looked increasingly unrealistic, and even optimistic forecasts acknowledged that Kaliningrad was entering a period of managed decline rather than recovery. The exclave was no longer simply affected by sanctions, it was defined by them. At the same time, the strategic stakes were rising. Kaliningrad sits at the heart of the Baltic security equation, hosting critical military infrastructure and advanced weapon systems. Any instability there resonates far beyond its borders. For Moscow, losing control politically or economically would be more than an embarrassment. It would undermine deterrence narratives built over decades. For neighboring states, the situation presents a delicate balance in force sanctions and security measures without triggering escalation. This tension makes Kaliningrad uniquely volatile, a place where economic hardship, military significance, and political symbolism collide. The opening shock of 2025, then, was not a single event, but a realization. Kaliningrad was no longer insulated by its special status or historical ambiguity. It had become a frontline region in a broader confrontation between Russia and the West, experiencing the consequences faster and more intensely than most. The question now is whether this pressure will harden loyalty through fear or quietly erode it through frustration and fatigue. As Kaliningrad adjusts to its new reality, one critical issue looms: can a region built on openness survive indefinitely behind walls it never chose? How did a territory once celebrated as Russia's most European region turn into a strategic headache for the very state that governs it? To understand Kaliningrad's current crisis, it is necessary to look back at what the exclave was becoming before war reshaped Europe's security landscape. For years, Kaliningrad functioned as an exception within the Russian system, developing an identity that was pragmatic, outward-looking, and quietly distinct from Moscow's centralized model. That evolution now stands in direct conflict with the Kremlin's wartime priorities. Before the invasion of Ukraine, Kaliningrad benefited from a rare combination of geography and policy. Its separation from mainland Russia forced adaptation. Local businesses learned to trade across borders, residents learned foreign languages, and institutions adopted practices closer to European norms than to Russian federal standards. This was not a formal political shift, but a cultural one. Urban planning emphasized livability. Tourism targeted European visitors, and regional universities cultivated intellectual ties that extended westward. The exclave became a place where Russian citizenship coexisted with European habits, producing a hybrid identity that felt sustainable as long as borders remained functional. That model depended on stability and trust. Kaliningrad's economy was never self-sufficient. It was efficient because it was connected. Food imports, industrial inputs, and consumer goods flowed through neighboring states, while local industries focused on processing logistics and services. This arrangement reduced costs and raised living standards relative to many Russian regions. By the early 2000s, passport ownership, cross-border travel, and exposure to foreign markets were significantly higher than the national average. Kaliningrad was not richer than Moscow, but it was more open, and that openness shaped expectations. The war disrupted this balance almost instantly. As Russia's confrontation with the West deepened, Kaliningrad's European-facing identity became politically inconvenient. What had once been tolerated as a regional peculiarity was reinterpreted as a vulnerability. Policies shifted from accommodation to control. Cross-border programs were suspended, cultural exchanges faded, and administrative oversight tightened. The Kremlin's message, hardened security, now outweighed integration, and loyalty mattered more than prosperity. For a region accustomed to flexibility, this shift felt abrupt and disorienting. The economic consequences reinforced the cultural rupture. Industries designed around access to European markets struggled to reorient toward Russia's interior, where demand patterns, logistics costs, and regulatory environments differed sharply. Efforts to replace lost trade with domestic alternatives proved inefficient. Transport routes grew longer, more expensive, and less reliable. Projects that once made sense on paper no longer added up when stripped of their cross-border logic. As a result, growth stalled, and planning horizons shrank, feeding a sense that Kaliningrad was being pulled backward rather than protected. Politically, this created a quiet contradiction. Kaliningrad's distinctiveness had long been an asset for Moscow, showcasing adaptability and reach. In a wartime environment, however, difference invites suspicion. Regional elites found themselves navigating a narrow path, emphasizing loyalty while attempting to manage local frustration. Public rhetoric stressed unity and resilience, but private concerns focused on declining competitiveness and demographic drift as younger residents reconsidered their futures. The very features that once made Kaliningrad useful, its openness, education levels, and outward orientation now complicated governance. This transformation also altered how the region was perceived abroad. European neighbors that once viewed Kaliningrad as a partner now see it primarily through a security lens. Cooperation has been replaced by caution and familiarity by distance. That shift further undermines the old model, leaving the exclave suspended between two systems it no longer fully belongs to. Neither integrated into Europe nor fully embedded in Russia's economic core, Kaliningrad occupies an uncomfortable middle ground. The deeper issue is structural. Kaliningrad was never meant to operate as a sealed fortress. Its development path assumed permeability, not isolation. By forcing the region into a role it was not built to play, Moscow has turned a former showcase into a liability. The question that now emerges is whether this identity fracture can be managed indefinitely, or whether prolonged pressure will push Kaliningrad toward outcomes the Kremlin is least prepared to confront. If openness created expectations that isolation cannot meet, how long can that tension remain contained? What happens when sanctions stop being abstract policy tools and begin reshaping daily survival? By 2025, Kaliningrad offers a clear answer. The exclave has become one of the most concentrated examples of how transit restrictions, financial pressure, and logistical choke points can hollow out a regional economy from the inside. Unlike inland regions, Kaliningrad cannot reroute quietly or absorb delays gradually. Every restriction hits faster, costs more, and lingers longer, turning structural dependence into a chronic vulnerability. The most immediate damage has come from transit disruption. Kaliningrad historically relied on rail and road corridors crossing neighboring states to receive fuel, raw materials, and industrial inputs. As controls tightened and compliance regimes hardened, these corridors became unreliable. Cargo volumes fluctuated, delivery times stretched unpredictably, and insurance and transport costs surged. Businesses that once operated on just-in-time logistics were forced to stockpile, tying up capital they did not have. Others simply shut down lines that could no longer operate profitably under the new constraints. Energy and construction sectors felt the pressure first. Reduced access to fuel products and industrial materials stalled projects and slowed maintenance across the region. Concrete producers, metal processors, and small manufacturers faced cascading shortages that rippled into housing infrastructure and municipal services. Each delay multiplied costs. By mid-2025, local authorities were quietly acknowledging that planned development targets were no longer achievable under existing conditions. Emergency adjustments replaced long-term strategy, and budgets began reflecting survival rather than expansion. Maritime routes were presented as the solution, but in practice they introduced a new set of problems. Shipping volumes through Kaliningrad's ports increased dramatically compared to pre-war levels, yet capacity did not scale smoothly. Ferries became bottlenecks. Prioritization favored large operators, and smaller firms struggled to secure slots. Transport costs by sea remained significantly higher than land routes, eroding margins and pushing consumer prices upward. What looked like resilience on paper masked an uneven system that benefited a few while suffocating many. The fiscal impact has been severe. Revenue growth failed to keep pace with rising expenditures tied to logistics subsidies, social support, and infrastructure maintenance. Deficits widened, forcing regional planners to rely more heavily on transfers that arrived slowly and covered less than advertised. Ambitious investment proposals surfaced as symbolic gestures rather than viable solutions, often exceeding what the regional economy could realistically sustain. These plans signaled desperation more than confidence, reflecting an awareness that the old economic model had collapsed without a replacement ready to take its place. For residents, the consequences became increasingly visible. Prices rose unevenly, availability fluctuated, and quality declined. Imported goods, once taken for granted, became occasional luxuries, while locally produced substitutes failed to match expectations. Small businesses, especially those tied to cross-border trade or tourism, found themselves squeezed out entirely. Employment became less stable and wage growth lagged behind inflation, quietly eroding purchasing power. The sanctions were not felt as a single shock, but as a slow grind that reshaped routines and aspirations. Strategically, this economic erosion carries broader implications. A region under constant logistical stress becomes harder to govern and more expensive to secure. Every additional subsidy diverts resources from other priorities, while every failure reinforces perceptions of neglect. For Moscow, Kaliningrad's economic fragility complicates military planning and political messaging alike. Strength projected outward must be supported inward, and that balance grows harder to maintain as costs rise and returns diminish. The deeper danger lies in normalization. As shortages and inefficiencies persist, they risk becoming accepted as the new baseline, lowering expectations but deepening resentment. Sanctions were designed to apply pressure, not to create humanitarian collapse. Yet in Kaliningrad, the line feels increasingly thin. The exclave's experience raises an uncomfortable question. If an economy engineered for connectivity is forced into isolation indefinitely, at what point does adaptation give way to irreversible decline? When economic pressure becomes constant, how long does social cohesion hold before it begins to fracture? In Kaliningrad, this question has moved from theory to lived reality. By 2025, rising discontent is no longer an abstract concern whispered in private. It is a visible undercurrent shaping behavior, attitudes, and identity in a region already struggling with isolation. The crisis is not expressed through mass protests or open defiance, but through something more difficult to contain: quiet alienation. Kaliningrad's society has long differed from that of mainland Russia. Exposure to Europe, frequent travel, and cross-border interaction shaped expectations that extended beyond material comfort. People became accustomed to choice, comparison, and relative openness. When those reference points disappeared, the loss was not merely economic. It was cultural. Daily life narrowed, horizons shortened, and the contrast between official narratives and personal experience grew sharper. This gap has become one of the most destabilizing forces in the region. The Kremlin's response has followed a familiar pattern: increased scrutiny, tighter messaging, and expanded security presence. Officials frame these measures as necessary to maintain stability in a strategically sensitive territory. For many residents, however, they reinforce the sense of being distrusted and managed rather than represented. Administrative checks multiply, public space feels more monitored, and even neutral expressions of frustration carry perceived risk. The result is a chilling effect that suppresses open debate without resolving the underlying causes of dissatisfaction. Identity plays a central role in this tension. Kaliningrad's population has never fully aligned with the symbolic narratives promoted from Moscow. Historical memory, urban culture, and regional pride form a distinct mix that resists easy categorization. Younger generations in particular show weaker emotional ties to Russia's interior and stronger familiarity with neighboring societies. As economic prospects narrow, this identity gap widens, feeding a sense that the region's future is being decided elsewhere without local input or benefit. Demographic signals underscore the trend. Skilled workers and students quietly explore opportunities beyond the exclave when possible, while those who remain recalibrate expectations downward. This slow drift does not register as crisis statistics, but over time, it erodes resilience. Communities lose initiative, innovation slows, and civic engagement retreats into safe, apolitical spaces. What replaces it is not rebellion, but fatigue, a condition that is harder to reverse and easier to ignore until it becomes entrenched. The paradox for Moscow is that repression addresses symptoms, not causes. Labeling dissent as extremism or foreign influence may deter visible opposition, but it cannot restore lost economic logic or cultural autonomy. Each crackdown signals insecurity, reinforcing perceptions that the center lacks confidence in its own narrative. In Kaliningrad, where people once experienced tangible benefits from openness, this approach feels especially hollow. Trust once broken cannot be rebuilt through control alone. At the same time, outright separatism remains risky and fragmented. Fear, surveillance, and the absence of external support limit organized movements. Yet discontent does not require organization to matter. It accumulates quietly, shaping how people interpret events, respond to policy, and imagine their future. In a region as strategically sensitive as Kaliningrad, even passive disengagement carries consequences. Loyalty rooted in habit rather than belief is inherently fragile. This social undercurrent intersects dangerously with economic strain. When material decline meets identity dissonance, patience thins. Residents begin asking questions that no amount of messaging can fully suppress. Why was a peaceful, cooperative way of life sacrificed for a distant war, and what is being offered in return? As these questions circulate privately, they create a latent pressure that may remain invisible until circumstances force it into the open. The critical uncertainty now is whether Kaliningrad's quiet frustration will dissipate through adaptation, or whether prolonged stress will eventually push it toward a breaking point few are prepared to manage. Can a heavily militarized territory remain politically stable when its civilian foundations are steadily eroding? Kaliningrad's role as a military stronghold has long defined how Moscow and NATO view the exclave. Yet by 2025, that same role has become a source of risk rather than reassurance. What was once presented as an unassailable bastion now sits atop fragile economic and social ground, creating a dangerous imbalance between hard power and human reality. Kaliningrad hosts some of Russia's most sensitive military assets in the Baltic region. Advanced missile systems, air defense networks, naval facilities, and electronic warfare capabilities give the exclave outsized strategic weight relative to its size. In theory, this concentration strengthens deterrence and extends Russia's reach deep into NATO's eastern flank. In practice, it also turns Kaliningrad into a high-value target in any escalation scenario, amplifying the consequences of miscalculation on all sides. Maintaining this military posture is expensive and logistically complex. Supplies, personnel rotations, and equipment upgrades all depend on the same strained transport networks that serve civilians. As economic pressure mounts, the competition for resources becomes more visible. Investments flow toward bases and infrastructure deemed critical for defense, while civilian needs are postponed or downsized. This prioritization may make strategic sense on paper, but it deepens resentment among residents who see their living standards decline while military activity intensifies around them. The presence of powerful weapon systems also heightens political sensitivity. Any sign of unrest or instability in Kaliningrad carries implications far beyond regional governance. For Moscow, the prospect of dissent in a territory hosting strategic assets is unacceptable, reinforcing the impulse toward surveillance and control. For NATO planners, the exclave represents both a threat and a vulnerability, a place where pressure could escalate rapidly, intentionally, or not in the event of crisis. This dual perception keeps Kaliningrad under constant scrutiny, raising the stakes of every local development. From a strategic perspective, the imbalance is clear. Deterrence relies not only on hardware, but on confidence in command, cohesion, and legitimacy. A population that feels marginalized or economically trapped does not strengthen those foundations. Instead, it introduces uncertainty. While there is no indication of immediate breakdown, the long-term risk lies in erosion rather than explosion. Systems can appear stable until they are suddenly not, especially when stress accumulates unevenly. The military footprint also distorts Kaliningrad's future options. Economic diversification becomes harder in a region dominated by security concerns where foreign investment is scarce and civilian innovation competes with secrecy and restrictions. This reinforces dependence on federal support and limits the region's ability to adapt organically. In effect, Kaliningrad becomes locked into a single role: strategic outpost, first, community, second. That hierarchy may serve short-term security goals, but it undermines long-term stability. For neighboring states, the situation demands caution. Any instability in Kaliningrad risks being interpreted through a military lens, increasing the chance of overreaction. At the same time, ignoring the region's internal pressures would be equally dangerous. A heavily armed territory experiencing social and economic decay is not a static threat. It is a dynamic one shaped by human factors as much as by missiles and radars. The core dilemma is unresolved. Kaliningrad's military value is undeniable, but it cannot substitute for legitimacy and prosperity. The more the exclave is treated solely as a fortress, the more its civilian weaknesses matter strategically. As pressure builds, the question becomes increasingly urgent. Can military strength alone compensate for a growing political and social deficit? Or does it ultimately magnify the consequences when that deficit can no longer be ignored? Could a crisis in a small Baltic exclave reshape security calculations far beyond its borders? By 2025, Kaliningrad's trajectory can no longer be separated from the broader pattern of global confrontation. What is unfolding there reflects not only Russia's internal strains, but also the way modern conflicts intersect across regions from Eastern Europe to the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific. Kaliningrad has become a case study in how localized pressure points feed into a much larger strategic puzzle. The war in Ukraine continues to dominate Europe's security environment, driving sustained military spending, force posture adjustments, and long-term planning within NATO. Kaliningrad sits uncomfortably close to these shifts. Its location near key transit corridors and alliance members ensures that every development there is interpreted through the lens of deterrence and escalation control. As NATO strengthens its eastern defenses, Kaliningrad's role as a forward-deployed Russian outpost grows more sensitive, increasing the risk that economic or social instability could spill into the military domain. This dynamic is not unique to Europe. Similar patterns appear elsewhere in 2025. In the Middle East, cycles of escalation and restraint highlight how heavily armed regions can become unstable when political legitimacy and economic resilience lag behind military capacity. In East Asia, tensions between major powers underscore the importance of credible deterrence paired with internal cohesion. Kaliningrad mirrors these global trends on a smaller scale, illustrating how strategic assets cannot be insulated from the societies that host them. For Western planners, the lesson is nuanced. Pressure works, but it works unevenly. Sanctions and containment strategies have constrained Russia's options and raised costs. Yet they also concentrate hardship in places like Kaliningrad, where adaptation is hardest. This creates dilemmas about escalation management. Excessive pressure risks unintended instability, while insufficient pressure undermines deterrence credibility. Balancing these factors requires constant recalibration rather than fixed assumptions. At the same time, Kaliningrad highlights a vulnerability within Russia's own strategy. Centralized control can suppress symptoms, but it cannot generate resilience where economic logic has been broken. The exclave's dependence on federal support and military prioritization makes it expensive to maintain and politically brittle. Over time, this drains resources and attention that Moscow must also allocate to other fronts, from Ukraine to distant theaters where influence is being contested. From a transatlantic perspective, the stakes are clear. Kaliningrad's stability matters not because it is likely to change status suddenly, but because it exemplifies the cumulative strain of prolonged confrontation. A region that once acted as a bridge now functions as a pressure valve. How that valve is managed will influence perceptions of strength, restraint, and credibility on all sides. Western policymakers must therefore consider not only how to deter aggression, but how to anticipate and manage the secondary effects of sustained pressure. The broader implication is strategic endurance. Conflicts in 2025 are not defined by quick victories, but by the ability to absorb costs over time. Kaliningrad tests that endurance for Russia in a uniquely concentrated way. Its future will signal whether isolation and militarization can coexist indefinitely with social stability, or whether cracks will continue to widen beneath the surface. As global tensions remain elevated, Kaliningrad stands as a reminder that geography does not guarantee control, and military power does not erase economic and social realities. The exclave's path forward will be shaped as much by internal resilience as by external pressure. The open question now facing policymakers and observers alike is whether Kaliningrad becomes a managed liability within a frozen confrontation, or a catalyst forcing difficult reassessments about how modern power is sustained in an interconnected yet increasingly divided world.